Unit 731, Japan's secret biological warfare program in the frozen wilderness of Manchuria, far from the eyes of the world, a secret complex of laboratories and furnaces once stood behind high barbed wire fences. There were no signs, no maps, and no survivors who could tell the full story. Only whispers, of doctors in white coats performing unspeakable experiments, of screams that vanished into the snow, and of a name erased from history for decades, Unit 731. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was one of the most horrifying biological warfare programs ever conceived, created, funded, and protected by the Imperial Japanese military. From 1936 to 1945, Unit 731 carried out lethal human experimentation on prisoners of war and civilians, Chinese, Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and even Allied soldiers. They were dissected alive, infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera, and subjected to experiments designed to push the limits of human endurance and suffering. But the most shocking part of this story isn't just the cruelty. It's what happened after. Because when Japan surrendered in 1945, the scientists behind Unit 731 were not executed or imprisoned. They were protected by the same country that had just defeated them. This is the story of Unit 731, the Empire's most terrible secret, and the moment when science crossed the line from discovery to damnation. Welcome to Secrets of the Battlefield. The birth of Unit 731. The story of Unit 731 begins in the early 1930s, as Japan's empire expanded across Asia. After invading Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese military established a puppet state called Manchukuo, a vast territory rich in land, resources, and, most importantly, human subjects the empire viewed as expendable. Within this occupied land, the Japanese Imperial Army saw an opportunity to push the limits of science in the name of warfare. At the time, the world's major powers were racing to master chemical and biological weapons. Japan, eager to prove itself as a global superpower, refused to fall behind. The mastermind behind the project was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless microbiologist and army surgeon. Educated at Kyoto Imperial University, Ishii was obsessed with the idea that biological warfare could be the ultimate weapon, invisible, unstoppable, and capable of wiping out entire populations without a single shot fired. In 1932, Ishii proposed the creation of a secret biological research unit within the Kwantung Army. The official purpose was to study disease prevention and develop vaccines. The real goal: to weaponize pathogens such as plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus, and to understand exactly how they destroyed the human body. By 1936, Ishii's plan became reality. The Japanese government granted him land near the city of Harbin, in the remote Manchurian plains, and full authority to build what would become Unit 731, a sprawling complex of laboratories, cells, crematoriums, and testing fields. The site was surrounded by tall fences, guard towers, and barbed wire. Inside, over 3,000 scientists, doctors, and soldiers worked under strict secrecy. To the outside world, the facility was listed as a water purification plant. Locals were told it was researching ways to fight epidemics. But those who lived nearby began noticing strange odors in the air and smoke rising from the chimneys at night. They called it the Devil's Factory. The prisoners held inside were known not by names, but by the term Maruta, meaning logs. It was a deliberate dehumanization. In reports, Ishii's men wrote not of human beings but of logs used for experiments. These logs included captured Chinese resistance fighters, peasants, women, children, and occasionally Allied POWs. Shiro Ishii demanded absolute loyalty from his staff and promised them scientific immortality. Under his command, Unit 731 began developing large-scale production systems for deadly pathogens, fleas infected with plague, water contaminated with cholera, and aerosols carrying anthrax spores. Ishii's dream was clear: to create weapons that could annihilate cities and armies without leaving a trace. To him, human lives were simply data points in the pursuit of perfection. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 had evolved into a full military-industrial research empire. It operated with the full support of Tokyo and the Kwantung Army, and soon expanded to include satellite units across Manchuria, Unit 100 in Changchun, Unit 1644 in Nanjing, and others. Each was dedicated to a different branch of biological warfare. Each was built upon suffering. And while the world's attention focused on Europe, far in the east, Japan's secret weapon was quietly preparing for war. The experiments inside the walls of Unit 731, science became a tool of horror disguised as research. Under the command of Shiro Ishii, thousands of doctors, surgeons, and microbiologists conducted experiments that broke every moral and ethical boundary known to mankind. The purpose of these experiments was not healing, it was destruction. Ishii believed that to develop effective biological weapons, scientists needed to understand how diseases spread and how the human body responded to infection in real time. The only way to gather that data, he claimed, was through direct human experimentation. Prisoners, the Maruta, were used as living test subjects. They were deliberately infected with deadly pathogens such as plague, anthrax, cholera, smallpox, and typhus. The scientists observed how long it took for the disease to take hold, what symptoms appeared, and how quickly death came. Every variable was carefully recorded: temperature, humidity, diet, age, and even emotional state. Ishii treated it as clinical research, a grotesque simulation of medical precision. Vivisection, the dissection of living people, was one of the most common procedures. Victims were cut open without anesthesia so that organs could be examined while still functioning. The goal was to observe how diseases affected internal organs in real time. Other experiments tested the limits of human endurance. Prisoners were locked in pressure chambers to measure how much air a person could lose before death. Others were exposed to extreme cold to study frostbite and hypothermia. Some were tied to stakes while biological bombs were detonated nearby to study the spread of infection. In separate wings of the complex, doctors injected subjects with horse blood, seawater, or even ground glass to study the body's reaction. Pregnant women were deliberately infected to examine the effects of pathogens on fetuses. All of it was conducted under the guise of epidemic prevention. The data was meticulously documented, and Shiro Ishii's subordinates often competed for his favor by producing more useful results, meaning more deaths. Outside the laboratories, large-scale field tests were carried out across Manchuria and China. Ceramic bombs filled with plague-infested fleas or cholera bacteria were dropped over villages and rivers. Entire communities fell sick within days. In 1940, outbreaks in Ningbo and Changde were later confirmed to have been caused by Unit 731's experiments. These attacks killed thousands and provided Ishii's team with what they called battlefield data. They were the first real-world biological warfare tests in history. Unit 731 also researched weapon delivery systems, shells, bombs, and even spray devices designed to spread pathogens through the air. By 1942, Ishii claimed his team could produce enough plague bacteria to kill entire cities. But Ishii's obsession went beyond military power. He wanted recognition, to prove that Japan's scientific elite could rival the West. To him, ethics were a Western weakness. Japan's destiny, he said, was to advance science through sacrifice. The sacrifice, of course, was human life. Unit 731 functioned like a factory of death disguised as a laboratory. The experiments were systematic, organized, and meticulously recorded. Every test had a number. Every death was logged. Every piece of data went into Ishii's files. And though the war would eventually end, the secrets buried within those files would survive, protected not by Japan, but by the very powers that defeated it. The weapons of death. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had evolved from a research facility into a full-scale production plant for biological weapons. Under Shiro Ishii's leadership, the Imperial Japanese Army began integrating germ warfare into its strategic plans for conquest. The unit's laboratories in Harbin produced massive quantities of pathogens, plague, anthrax, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery, each cultivated, weaponized, and tested for battlefield use. Ishii's scientists became engineers of disease. They developed new ways to spread infection across vast areas, often disguising their weapons as ordinary objects. Ceramic bombs were designed to shatter upon impact, releasing millions of plague-infested fleas into the air. Contaminated food, clothing, and medical supplies were distributed to unsuspecting civilians. Rivers and wells were deliberately poisoned with cholera and typhoid bacteria. Their goal was total infection, not simply to kill, but to destabilize entire regions through uncontrollable epidemics. Japan's invasion of China provided the perfect testing ground. Ishii's team coordinated directly with the Kwantung Army to deploy biological weapons against civilian populations and Chinese troops. In 1940, plague bombs were dropped over Ningbo and Kojo, causing outbreaks that spread uncontrollably through the region. Entire villages vanished from maps, consumed by disease. In one field test, Japanese aircraft dropped wheat and rice mixed with plague fleas. When survivors buried their dead, the fleas spread further. What began as an experiment became an epidemic. At its peak, Unit 731's facilities were capable of producing 300 kilograms of plague bacteria and 600 kilograms of anthrax spores per month. These quantities were enough to infect hundreds of thousands of people. The pathogens were stored in temperature-controlled chambers, loaded into bombs, and shipped to military airfields for deployment. Japan's military planners envisioned an arsenal that could change the course of the war. If cities like Chongqing, Calcutta, or even San Francisco could be infected, the empire believed it could win without direct confrontation. In 1944, Ishii even proposed a desperate plan, using submarine-launched aircraft to spread plague across the US West Coast. The operation, codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night, was scheduled for 1945, but Japan's surrender came before it could be executed. Meanwhile, Unit 731's satellite branches expanded across Asia. Unit 100, located in Changchun, specialized in infecting livestock to destroy enemy food supplies. Unit 1644, based in Nanjing, refined techniques for spreading cholera and typhoid in rivers. Other divisions developed portable sprayers, time-release bombs, and protective suits for Japanese soldiers who might operate in contaminated zones. Yet none of these weapons were ever used against major Western powers. Ishii and his superiors feared that deploying them against the US or Britain could trigger devastating retaliation. Instead, the people of China bore the full brunt of Japan's biological warfare. It was a silent genocide, one that left no ruins, only sickness and death. Even within the ranks of the Imperial Army, some officers questioned the morality of Ishii's work. But few dared to oppose him. He was charismatic, well-connected, and seen as indispensable to Japan's war effort. The Emperor's inner circle knew of Unit 731 and continued funding it until the very end. By 1945, as Japan faced defeat, Ishii realized his empire of science was collapsing. He ordered the destruction of all evidence, laboratories burned, prisoners executed, and entire facilities blown up. Thousands of logs were killed to ensure no witnesses survived. When Soviet troops advanced on Manchuria in August 1945, they found only ashes, and rumors of a place where disease had been turned into a weapon. But the world would soon learn that those responsible for Unit 731 didn't vanish with the smoke. They simply changed uniforms. The cover-up when Japan surrendered in August 1945, the empire's crimes were expected to face the light of justice. But deep within the ruins of Manchuria, Unit 731's scientists were already executing a plan to erase their sins. As Soviet forces closed in, Shiro Ishii ordered the complete destruction of the Harbin complex. Laboratories were dynamited, documents burned, and prisoners executed to prevent any witnesses from surviving. Fleets of trucks carried the remaining staff south under false identities. The Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department was gone, as if it had never existed. When the war ended, Ishii was captured by US occupation authorities. The Americans knew he was no ordinary prisoner. They suspected that Unit 731 had produced data the world had never seen before. As the Cold War began to take shape, the United States faced a new enemy, the Soviet Union. Biological warfare knowledge suddenly became a strategic asset. The US government, led by General Douglas MacArthur's administration in Tokyo, made a fateful choice. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his team for war crimes, they offered him immunity in exchange for their research. Over the next several months, secret negotiations took place between US intelligence officers and former Unit 731 scientists. The Americans wanted everything: detailed data on human infection, frostbite, trauma, and biological weapon development. Ishii, fully aware of the value of his work, presented it as irreplaceable. He argued that no Western nation would ever repeat such experiments. Therefore, his results were unique and scientifically priceless. He was right. The United States agreed to his terms. In return for full cooperation, Ishii and his top officers were never tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The official explanation stated that no conclusive evidence had been found. But behind the scenes, US intelligence officers were secretly transporting Unit 731's data and its scientists into American hands. This deal mirrored the infamous Operation Paperclip, where Nazi scientists were absorbed into US research programs. The same pattern repeated in Asia: atrocities erased for the sake of scientific advantage. Meanwhile, the Soviets conducted their own investigations. In 1949, during the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, the USSR prosecuted 12 Japanese officers involved in biological warfare. They presented testimony from captured scientists and survivors that exposed the full horror of Unit 731's activities. But in the West, the trials were dismissed as propaganda. The world chose not to believe. As years passed, the former members of Unit 731 quietly reintegrated into post-war Japan. Many found positions in medicine, academia, and government. Dr. Masaji Kitano became head of the Green Cross Pharmaceutical Company. Others became university professors, hospital directors, and medical researchers. Shiro Ishii himself lived in comfort in Tokyo, dying of throat cancer in 1959. Never convicted, never punished. The truth of Unit 731 remained classified in US military archives for decades. When fragments of information finally surfaced, they were dismissed as conspiracy theories. Even the Japanese government avoided acknowledging the unit's existence, fearing diplomatic repercussions. It wasn't until survivors and former soldiers began to speak out in the 1980s that the full scale of the cover-up became undeniable. Documents, testimonies, and declassified intelligence files revealed the moral compromise at the heart of the post-war order: justice had been traded for knowledge. Unit 731 did not end with Japan's surrender. It was buried, bought, and forgotten. And for decades, the world's most powerful nations benefited from its data, built on suffering that could never be repeated. Legacy and reckoning: for decades after the war, Unit 731 remained a ghost, a rumor whispered among historians and survivors, denied by officials and ignored by governments. Japan's post-war narrative focused on its own suffering, not the crimes it had committed. Textbooks skipped the topic. Museums remained silent. And the names of the doctors who had served under Shiro Ishii appeared in medical journals and university plaques, celebrated as pioneers rather than war criminals. But truth has a way of resurfacing. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a group of journalists, scholars, and victims' families began to piece together what had happened in Harbin. Declassified Soviet files, survivor testimonies, and old military records began to paint a picture that could no longer be ignored. Former guards and medical assistants came forward, haunted by what they had witnessed. They described the special prisons, the freezing chambers, and the laboratories filled with cages and steel tables. One after another, they confirmed the unimaginable. Unit 731 had been real. Public pressure grew, both in Japan and abroad. Survivors and activists demanded that the Japanese government acknowledge its biological warfare program and issue formal apologies to the victims. But Tokyo's response remained muted. Officially, the government claimed that no definitive evidence could be found. Even today, Japan has never formally admitted the full extent of Unit 731's crimes. Meanwhile, the legacy of its research lived on in ways few could have predicted. The scientific data collected through torture and death was quietly integrated into military and medical studies around the world. U.S. intelligence archives show that reports from Unit 731 influenced aspects of biological defense research during the Cold War. Though the results were never officially published, fragments of Ishii's work appeared in studies on frostbite treatment, wound infection, and epidemic response. The victims, however, received nothing. No compensation. No recognition. No justice. In 1997, a historic lawsuit was filed in Tokyo by Chinese victims and families of those killed by Unit 731. They demanded an official apology and reparations. The Japanese court acknowledged the existence of the atrocities but dismissed the case, stating that individuals could not claim damages from a state for wartime actions. It was a symbolic victory, and a moral defeat. Today, the remains of Unit 731's main facility in Harbin stand as a museum and memorial. Visitors walk through the same hallways where thousands once suffered in silence. Photographs, artifacts, and recovered instruments tell the story that Japan once tried to erase. Each year, survivors and their descendants gather to honor the victims, not as soldiers or enemies, but as human beings sacrificed to the machinery of war. The story of Unit 731 is more than a record of cruelty, it is a warning. It reminds the world how science, when separated from morality, can become one of the darkest forces imaginable. It shows how ambition and nationalism can justify anything, even the transformation of doctors into executioners. Shiro Ishii's dream of power through biology ended in ashes, but its consequences still echo today in the global struggle over ethics in warfare, experimentation, and truth. History often remembers the victors. But the victims of Unit 731 remind us that silence can be more dangerous than defeat. Because what humanity refuses to confront, it risks repeating. The price of silence. Unit 731 is not just a chapter of history, it is a mirror. A reflection of what happens when science loses its soul, when human beings become statistics, and when nations choose secrecy over justice. The men who built Unit 731 believed they were serving progress. They saw themselves as pioneers, doctors, researchers, patriots. But the legacy they left behind proves a darker truth. Intelligence without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. For decades, the crimes of Unit 731 were hidden, its survivors silenced, and its leaders protected. Even now, much of its history remains buried in classified archives. But truth does not die in darkness. It waits, patient, unforgotten, for the world to face it. Every time humanity looks away from its past, it gives power to those willing to repeat it. And every time we confront it, we reclaim a piece of our conscience. This is why the story of Unit 731 must be remembered, not to shock, not to accuse, but to remind. That knowledge gained through suffering is not progress. That silence is never neutral. And that the pursuit of power, without morality, always ends the same way, in ruin. Thank you for watching. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more untold truths from the shadows of history. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and never stop asking why.